Welcome back. So now we're pretty much done with the core part of our feature of get all. Now we want to talk about how we can do it with the repository and how we can actually start getting some real data from a real database. And we're going to try and do it test-driven still, but it's going to give us a few hassles that we need to kind of get through. But first of all, let's talk a little bit about how we want the communication between the database and the repository to be. And I'm going to use the entity framework. The entity framework is Microsoft's way of communicating with the database, and it's their ORM framework, Object Relation Mapping framework, that we are going to use right here. They use something called a DB context in order to communicate and set up DB connection, set up the different tables we need, relations, everything that we need. We're going to use a DB context for that. But the problem is the DB context is not easy to kind of do test-driven development with because it doesn't have any interfaces and we can't override anything. So it's really hard to mock the DB context in our system right here, but I still want to do it. So we're going to use a helper class in order to do that, or a helper project in order to do that. But let's just talk a little bit about what we actually want to accomplish. For this feature that we're building right now, the get all feature for products, we need to somehow set up a DB context in the repository. We need to use that DB context to kind of get access to the database and get all our products. And that's what we want to do, test-driven, set all of that up. But I also want to talk a little bit about how important it is to unit test this area. Now, in my mind, this is not the most important area to unit test. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but the reason is that the core is what we are going to, with the onion architecture, keep safe. That's the part that you really need to do testing. You need to test everything in the core, but at some point we might decide to switch the repository for a new repository. So if we're talking about you had a limited amount of time, always pick the core. That's where you want to do the testing. And then the repository or the infrastructure, that's your second choice, right? But still, we want to do test-driven development here in my tutorial right here, so we're going to try and do it. So let's jump into Microsoft's own guide right here and actually see what they say about testing. They say on their link right here, testing code that uses EF Core. It pretty much says that you shouldn't mock. You shouldn't mock your data. You shouldn't do this using mocking. You should actually use a real database, or at least something kind of close to a production system. Now, that's okay, but the problem with this is that you're doing integration testing instead of unit testing in my mind. And that means that each of your tests are going to be slower, right? So instead of having something really blazing fast, you're going to get something that might take a bit of time to execute. Again, it's not a problem with 2 tests or 5 tests, but it's a problem when you have to run 100 tests or 200 or 500 tests every time you've written something or refactored something, and it takes maybe 2 minutes, maybe 5 minutes to get that done. Then it starts being a real hassle in your system. So that's why we don't want to use a production database system in my solution anyway. But this is their first approach, and again, you can go and read the documentation. They say this is the best way to do it, but it can also be kind of slow, and in this case, it's pretty hard because it's not available on Linux to do a MS SQL local DB. But still, there's some good examples on how you can do it here, using Docker, for instance. Second approach, using SQLite. Now, in our system, we are going to end up with SQLite, so it sounds like a great idea to pick the SQLite solution. But again, it's going to be a bit slower than making pure unit tests. We cannot make pure unit tests in this setup right here, but we can get close to it. But still, if you want to, you can use the SQLite. Now again, you have to remember that SQLite is not the same as a production database if you're using MS SQL, for instance, a bigger database, and it might behave differently then. But again, we're going to use SQLite, so it's not a problem for us. The final solution that they kind of encourage right here is to use in-memory database. But that's not a relational database. It doesn't support transaction, it cannot run SQL queries raw, and it's not optimized for performance. So we don't care. Again, my goal is not to make this, my goal is not to kind of make a database here. My goal is to test that I'm calling certain things to create the database or to work with the database. So I really honestly don't care about performance right now. I can always change that, but I don't want the unit test to be slow. So I know it's kind of different, but we'll have a look at it. Now they talk a little bit about unit testing here in the end and how we can kind of set that up where they are actually using an in-memory database for their own internal unit testing. And you can of course do that. How do we fix this then? What do we want to do? Do we want to use these 3 solutions? And actually the answer is no. I'm going to use a fourth solution. That's this one. This is a person who went in there and said, maybe we can make a mix of both worlds and make something that can use the relational mindset and still use the in-memory part as I read it at least. So this is the one that we're going to try and use, this framework right here called Entity Framework Core Testing, We want to use that, and from that we're going to try and actually do mocked DB context. And using that we can now start doing test-driven development again to kind of create our system slowly from the bottom up. Now again, notice I'm not testing right here that the DB context or the entity framework from Microsoft is working. I'm testing that I'm calling the right methods inside the DB context, because I don't care how Microsoft built it. I believe they did it a perfect job. I don't have to kind of be a police officer there, but I need to kind of test that my code calls the right methods in their framework. So that's why we're going to try next lesson to install this and use this entity framework core testing framework right here and see if we can get it up and running. So that's it for this lesson. Next lesson we'll try and mock this, and see you next time. Bye.